Communicating public policy research can be tricky, especially when the research challenges current policy. How you communicate research findings is the difference between resistance and movement forward. What are the most effective strategies in communicating public policy research? From elevator speeches to public testimony, how do researchers adapt their communication styles and techniques to make sure that the findings are considered in the policymaking process? Welcome to the School of Public Policy's series on strategies for career and leadership success. Today, we invite you to join the conversation as we speak with Penn State alum Lauren Knoth about communicating policy research. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communication for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, along with Catherine Baumgartner, our Director for Professional Development and Student Engagement. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Whitney. It's great to be here today, and thank you for everyone joining us today.
Yes, thank you. Our guest today is Lauren Knoth. She's the Senior Research Associate in Criminal Justice at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. Lauren oversees WSIPP's portfolio of criminal justice research encompassing both juvenile justice and adult correction systems. Some of her most recent work includes casual evaluations of juvenile justice programs like the Washington State Aggression Replacement Training Program, evaluations of Washington Department of Corrections Dynamic Risk Assessment Instrument, evaluations of legislative changes to Washington State's truancy petition process, and classifications of evidence-based and research-based juvenile justice programs. In addition to completing timely public policy research, Lauren frequently consults with various Washington State agencies, the Washington State Legislature, and national criminal justice policy organizations. Welcome, Lauren. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Again, I want to remind everyone, all of our participants, that this is an event for you, and we want to welcome you to ask questions throughout the discussion. So do not hesitate to use that Q&A or that chat window throughout the event. So Lauren, I wanted to begin with some background on WSIPP, the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. So if you could give everyone a little bit of background and talk about the main areas of research.
Yeah, so WSIPP is what we are referred to as by most organizations here. Washington State likes to use lots of acronyms. We are a nonpartisan public policy research agency, and we conduct research at the direction of the legislature, the Washington State Legislature, and our board of directors. Our board of directors comprises members of the legislature. It has equal representation from both the House and the Senate and both parties, Republican and Democrat, and then some appointees from the governor's office and representatives from the major state universities. And so we do work directly from the legislature when they give us assignments, but we can also contract with state agencies, local agencies, or even some external third parties. Like we've previously done quite a bit of work with Pew Charitable Trusts. And our research, we're a multidisciplinary agency, so we don't focus in one particular area, but our two largest portfolios are in education and criminal justice. So on the education side, everything from K through 12 to post-secondary education. And then on the criminal justice side, both juvenile and adult. And then we've done some work in mental health, behavioral health, healthcare policy. And then we've had even just kind of one-off assignments like ferry building, because there's a lot of ferry ships here in the state of Washington. And so we sometimes will get a random assignment that's kind of outside of our big portfolios, but we'll tackle anything that the legislature asks of us.
Catherine, you're mute.
I do that at least once a day. Such a wide and varied areas of policy that you impact, Lauren. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what it's like to be a researcher and what is your role as a researcher in the policymaking process?
Yeah, I think it's unique. We sometimes refer to ourselves as pracademics or academic adjacent. And so at WSIPP, we really strive to maintain cutting edge methodological standards and really strive to have the highest level of rigor in our research. And so in that way, it's a lot like being in the academic community, and it's a multidisciplinary unit of individuals with master's degrees and PhDs in various fields, but pretty much all of us have experience in quantitative methods. And so it makes it pretty fun that we all can come together and ask each other different questions and challenge each other to improve our research. But as far as being in the policy arena, our job really is to support the legislature and to support the policymakers insofar as providing them with information so that they can make informed decisions. Washington State really privileges data-driven decision-making and evidence-based decision-making. And so a lot of times legislators will have questions about what the state of different conditions looks like prior to making policy decisions, or they'll ask us to evaluate the efficiency or the effectiveness of a policy decision that they've previously made. Our job is not to make policy recommendations. And so I think that that is one thing that's really unique about being a nonpartisan researcher at a nonpartisan institute, that we do not make policy recommendations. We just speak to what the data say and what we can evaluate and examine with data. But we recognize that the decisions that are made by policymakers oftentimes include so many factors that we can't consider. And so an example of that would be, we do a lot of cost benefit analysis where we'll look at the effectiveness of a program, whether or not it actually achieves its outcomes. And then we'll also evaluate whether or not that program is cost beneficial. And so sometimes we'll find programs that they do work, and they do work to reduce recidivism among juveniles, for example, for youth involved in the juvenile court. But maybe that program isn't cost beneficial. And so the legislature has to decide kind of what their priorities are and what decisions they want to make given all of the information. And so for us, it's really just providing them with information so that they have more tools to make their decisions, their final decisions. But we're not making policy recommendations ourselves.
Really providing that data and then stepping back and allowing the
Right.
process to use what you found.
So talk to us about navigating some of those situations where you might get a little bit of pushback from policymakers, where they might want a little bit more of the advice side from you, even though you're supposed to remain, have that unbiased research perspective and step back from it like you're talking about.
Yeah, I think for me, this comes up quite a bit in working in the criminal justice world, especially over the last year or two. There's been a lot of movement in the criminal justice reform area, but it's important to kind of hold steady in that perspective that I don't make policy recommendations, and to make it clear to them that the information that I have, I'm looking at a very particular piece of information or a very specific question, and that there are other things they may want to consider. So there are lots of times where I do get questions of like, so what should we do? And the response is always the same, which is that's a policy decision. And so insofar as I have research that can help inform that decision, I can pull on that and reiterate that and help them understand, well, if you choose this option, here's what the research says is likely to happen. And if you choose this option, here's what the research says is likely to happen. But what outcome they actually want in the end, I can't make that decision for them. And there's so many value-based judgments that happen in policymaking and prioritization of those values that are really beyond my role as an objective researcher. We sometimes, I'm on the fence about how I feel about this term, but we oftentimes refer to ourselves as dispassionate observers. And so you have to kind of embody that role of being objective, and I'm just observing and I'm evaluating the data and providing information. But I don't have a particular vested interest in the outcome one way or another, because that kind of impartiality is really important to rigorous research, particularly in the policy arena when there are so many competing opinions.
And that's really something that sounds like a really important lesson, especially for soon to be grads or people considering going into this policy sphere, because we know this is an area for people who are very passionate about social issues. You were just mentioning, the Black Lives Matter movement and you going into the criminal justice field. What do you tell current students and soon to be graduates as they're going out into the career field, into their careers? What do you talk to them about, especially if their research isn't followed or taken up right away?
I think as a young professional or going into setting up your career, leaving graduate school, one of the important things is you have to have an honest conversation with yourself about what you want to do and what you are comfortable doing. And so nonpartisan work isn't for everyone. And I recognize that. And there are some days when it is harder than others. And there are some times when it is difficult. Especially when there's so much going on socially and you're exposed to so many different things. In my role as a nonpartisan researcher, I carry that role inside and outside of the workplace. No campaign signs in my front yard, no campaign t-shirts, out on the streets, and maintaining that nonpartisan persona 24/7. And so I think that that's really important for my credibility as a researcher and for multiple individuals and individuals from different backgrounds to be able to listen to me and to trust me and to trust that the research that I'm doing is quality and that it is impartial. But I also recognize that's not for everyone. And so I have a lot of friends and colleagues who I went through grad school with that they know that they could not do that, and that they're strong about their passions and they want to be vocal about their passions, and there is totally a place for that. And so I think trying to figure out before you start your career, what is it that you really want to do? What are you most comfortable with? Are you comfortable being in a position where you have to be totally impartial and that dispassionate observer, or not? And if not, then pursuing, there's tons of different policy agents, public policy research groups that aren't nonpartisan. There's a lot of private research entities that have particular agendas. They're fighting for a particular cause. Those are really great agencies. And really great institutes to work at. Even in the government world, there's a difference between my job at a nonpartisan institute and a research position at an executive agency. So at an executive agency, you're working under a representative from the executive branch, and that's not a nonpartisan role. And so what you can say, or the policy recommendations that you make, or kind of the research questions that you're looking at, are going to be fundamentally different than a nonpartisan role. So I think it's a little bit about just knowing yourself and taking that time to figure it out, and figure out what you really are comfortable with, and being honest with yourself, because there's value in both career paths and both different types of public policy. But they do definitely carry different responsibilities too.
I want to remind our participants that we are encouraging you to join the conversation using that Q&A or the chat throughout the entire conversation. Lauren's here to answer your questions about communicating policy research, so don't be shy.
Listening to you, Lauren, it's clear that the understanding yourself and understanding what you can and can't do with respect to where you want to make an impact is important. I'm curious, even though you're not advising on policy, does WSIPP do any type of measurement of the impact of your policy research on what actually happens with policy?
A little bit. A lot of it is informal, just that we have great relationships with legislative staff, legislators, and different state agencies. And so we're in conversations constantly about research that we've done and changes that have been made in response to research that we've done, and what's happening now. And there's a lot of discussions that we have about if a policy is changed in response to our research, then we'll have agencies reach out and ask us what additional things they should be measuring now post this additional change. Mm-hmm. We also, with our cost beneficial work, which is a huge part of our portfolio, with our cost beneficial work, we've done some work in the past looking at kind of portfolios of legislative changes that if the legislature were to adopt X, Y, and Z policies, here's what the total economic return would be on the state. And so we do a lot of that discussion with regards to economic savings for the state, and then reinvestments of those savings. And then there are some times when we have published, just recently last year, for example, we published an article on the evolution of juvenile justice system and the changes in populations and policy and practical research. And that was a big piece that was in response to changes in research that was coming out. And so WSIPP has been involved in the juvenile justice world of research since the early 1990s, maybe late 1980s. And over the last 20, 30 years, we've seen such significant changes in our populations, but we're also seeing changes in the outcomes of our research. So programs that we said were effective in the late 90s or early 2000s, we're finding in updated studies that they're not as effective anymore. And so we published a supplemental piece to discuss these kind of changes over time and how policy responded to research. And in that piece, I'd encourage anyone interested in public policy to read it, even if you're not interested in criminal justice, because it talks about kind of the cycle of research and policy, that there are outcome evaluations or evaluations that inform big policy decisions. And then there's a policy decision that's made. And then there's a really important step of kind of monitoring the implementation and monitoring those changes. And that's not huge scale outcome evaluations or large scale studies, but the importance of continuously tracking things. And then after enough time has passed, revisiting that policy decision with a larger outcome evaluation to then inform changes in policy. And so it's this continuous cycle that creates this relationship between policy and researchers, where research can really inform the best case scenario for policymakers and the most effective changes. But then it should still be evaluated afterward to make sure that those policy changes met the goals.
We're getting some questions.
Closes the loop for the researcher, so that you guys feel that you have made a difference, even though you're not making policy. Whitney.
We're getting a lot of questions coming in, which I'm excited to see. One is from Amanda Snyder, one of our students in the Master of Public Policy program here at Penn State, and we have some others from across the country, which is really great to see as well. Amanda is asking, how much do you get involved in doing your own research versus how much do you seek out or rely on outside expertise? Do you think learning research methods is important before going into a job like yours?
I think to answer the last question first, research methods is absolutely critical in if you are pursuing a path in public policy research. Really understanding how to evaluate policies and how to evaluate policies appropriately, because the research that we're doing, and I think this is so important and to remember as a public policy researcher, that the research that you're doing is affecting people's lives. And you can't take that lightly. And I know I personally don't take that lightly. That what I say in the publications that I'm doing is potentially informing decisions that are affecting real lives. And especially in the juvenile justice world, I think about it so often that these are some of the most vulnerable kids in our system that really need the best assistance and the best support. And so I want to make sure that the research I'm putting out, I'm 100% confident in. And the way that you're confident in it is having really rigorous research methods that you can stand behind. So it's not your opinion. It's not your own personal agenda, but it's that you've done due diligence with the data to prove that that the outcomes are real, that you're evaluating. As far as my job and my own research, at WSIPP, we don't choose our assignments. So we work at the behest of the legislature and our board of directors. And so if the legislature wants us to answer a question, we answer that question. We are actually contract-based funded. And so our funding comes from every individual assignment from the legislature. The legislature says, we want you to evaluate this thing or answer this question, and we're going to give you so much money to do it. And then the other way that we get research projects and funding is through our contracts with state agencies. So when it's a state agency has a need, like Department of Corrections needs someone to evaluate their risk assessment instrument, they will contract with us for a certain amount of money. We don't have standing funds or a lot of standing funds to do our own research. And so we're not choosing our own research projects. I have no control over that agenda, but I do have a lot of communication with legislators and legislative staff and different stakeholders across the state about policy areas they're working on and potential policy changes they're going to make. And I can help work with them to help let them know what research could tell them. So how research could support their path towards reforming this part of the system. And so there is some of that, but it's not because I personally have an interest in that, and that's what my research agenda is. It's because these are the policy needs of the state, and they need to make this policy decision. And I know that I can help give them information to make the best decision. And so it's not a lot of choice in my job at all.
We have some of our other students are asking questions, and I want to get to this one to follow up on that. That says, hi from Kentucky. How do you keep up to date on the latest analytical techniques after graduate school, conferences, or research independently?
We do a lot of webinars. My agency is great because our whole design is that we are a rigorous research institute for the state of Washington. And so my administration is great at supporting professional development. And that's part of the deal, that we want to be still on the forefront and keep fresh with methods. So a lot of webinars, we are constantly sharing information. We have kind of an intranet at our office where we're sharing methods information, new articles that come out. We have a lot of informal, even like brown bag sessions at our office, like just lunchtime chats about, hey, this new method came out. And I've read some articles. Do you want to read some articles and let's talk about it? So it's a lot of sharing information that way. I also am privileged to have the opportunity to take courses at state universities, tuition free as a state employee. And so if there's a new method that comes out that I really want, or a method that I just want a refresher on, I can audit a course at UW, at the University of Washington, in their statistics department, and just get up to speed. And so we've had a lot of staff members who occasionally will take a course just to either sharpen their methods or learn a new method. And then, like I said, asynchronous webinars. I think with the pandemic, especially the expansion of asynchronous webinars and internet training systems has really expanded. And so like I'm currently in a structural equation modeling webinar that's asynchronous. I have 6 months to just kind of do it as it fits in my schedule. And my administration supports that by allowing me to do it on the clock as professional development.
That's great. So I want to get to a couple questions from some of our students, including 2 of our first year students. We have one from Sam Nur who says, was there any part of your policy work that you feel grad school didn't prepare you for that you had to learn on the job? And so this kind of may follow up on some of the stuff that you're doing in this professional development work.
Some of the method stuff, yes. I do think, though, the biggest thing that grad school didn't fully prepare me for was talking with policymakers. And so bringing it kind of back to the core of this topic for the webinar, you have to learn how to communicate complicated research to people who have no research background. And maybe they have some research background, but most of the time, the policymakers that I'm working with, the legislators or the members of state agencies, they're practitioners. They're not statisticians. They don't have a lot of quantitative background. And so you can't just come in and start talking about, well, we did this study and it's great because we've eliminated the selection bias by using entropy weighting, and like that's going to go nowhere. They're not going to understand what you're saying. And so it's really important that you can establish credibility by being able to communicate information to individuals who don't have that research background. I didn't teach when I was in graduate school. I taught one course when I was getting my Ph.D. Over the summer, but I think that that's kind of the closest that I could relate to as far as like the portable skill and where you get that in graduate school. It's not in your graduate school seminars because you're surrounded by other graduate students who are also robust in these methods and understanding the literature, and your professors, but it's in how do you communicate that to a first-year undergraduate student? Can you communicate that to a first-year undergraduate student? And that is your opportunity to really develop those skills for communicating complex topics in a way that's accessible to individuals who don't have that background.
We have more coming in from our students, but I want to follow up on that question from Sam really quickly. How do you adapt that communication for different audiences, and how important are things like data visualization and stuff like that in that communication?
And so I used to do collegiate debate. As some more background, I competed in collegiate debate in my undergrad, and then I coached it once I was in grad school for quite a while. And in debate, we have this acronym called JOY, and it's judge, opponent, yourself. And what I do now is not competitive. I'm not in an adversarial environment, but I still think that that concept rings true and is what I teach my fellow staff members, and what I'm talking, how I like kind of coach people into how they communicate and how to adapt. And so it's not a judge, but it is the people that you're trying to communicate to, the people that you want to be receptive to your information. Who are you trying to get to understand what you're saying, and understanding where they're coming from? What's their background? Do you know anything about their particular interests in different areas? If I have a study that looks at a range of outcomes from public safety to health and racial disparity, maybe I know that this individual is going to be more receptive if I start with public safety, because that's a big part of their legislative agenda. And so that's how I can kind of get my foot in the door, is by starting meeting them where they are. And so who am I trying to persuade? You don't have an opponent, but you will always have critics in your research. And so can you anticipate the criticisms? And so we do a lot of practice presentations at WSIPP, for example. Anytime we have a legislative presentation, if we have enough time, sometimes we just get a call and we have to go. But if we have time to prepare, or if we're presenting to a state agency, we internally will present to our staff of about 20 people, and it's usually about 8 to 12 that are able to show up. And we ask each other the questions that we think other people are going to ask, because you want to hear those questions first from a colleague, someone that you trust, someone that you're comfortable with, so that you can figure out what is the best approach, what is the best answer to this. Am I fully prepared to answer all of the criticisms? And there are some things that you can even be preemptive about. In our field and in our research, we think it's very important to be fully transparent about limitations in the research, because again, your research is impacting real people. And so if there's a limitation or any hesitation in your research, you should be honest about that. And that shouldn't be something that you try to hide or shy away from, but you should be transparent. So what are the likely criticisms? And then yourself, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Part of the beauty of working at a multidisciplinary institute is that if I get asked to come to a presentation and it's something where, yeah, 80% of the information they want, I know I'm really strong on, that's my bread and butter. I could talk about that all day long, but I know they're going to have questions about this other area that I'm not as much of an expert in, but I know my staff member is. So I'm going to bring her with me to this presentation and make sure that I have backup, and make sure that there's someone there who can answer those questions. And so recognizing your own limitations and your own strengths and weaknesses before going to present, and either reaching out to a colleague and having someone there with you to back you up, or just knowing what your weakness is and not letting it be a weakness. Tackle that, invest in that, and really work on that as a growth area, so that it's not a weakness for you anymore. And so that is, to me, adaptations. Who are you talking to? What are your likely criticisms? What are people likely to say about your research? And can you answer that in a way that's not defensive? You don't want to be reactive. You want to have thought about all of these things first. And then knowing yourself, I think, is critically important.
We have several other questions. I'm wondering if Catherine wants to say anything. That a lot of that is what she studies, especially the teamwork and leadership aspects there. But Catherine,
yeah, I mean, I'm sitting here listening to you, Lauren, and thinking about just how much you've really highlighted how important it is to be intentional and to be prepared, and to not kind of wing it when it comes to these kinds of situations. And the more prepared you are, and the more you spend time with your team, leaning into each other's strengths, the better prepared you are to share your message that ultimately, as you pointed out, impacts the people that are served by the state of Washington. So
yeah,
a lot in there to unpack.
So I think we kind of hinted at some of this, but I wanted to mention one of our first year students, Kinga Toth, asks, what extracurricular projects did you do to position yourself on the market during your time in school? How did you connect with professors initially regarding research projects? So you kind of talked a little bit about what you did in school, but maybe a little bit more.
I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was pretty sure I didn't want to take an academic path, but I didn't want to close that door. And so for me, it was about pursuing multiple lines in your CV or your resume that set you up for different types of opportunities. So for the public policy aspect, most of my research while I was in graduate school did focus on kind of outcome evaluations and questions of policies and court decision making. And so I didn't do a lot of theory driven work, and some of my colleagues at Penn State did, but I never did too much of that. The biggest thing was for my graduate assistantship, I worked at the Pennsylvania Commission on Sentencing for 6 years, the 6 years that I was at Penn State. And that was a great opportunity because it is very similar to WSIPP in that it's a state agency that informs policy, but it does research with a really high level of rigor. And so there's partnerships sometimes between agencies or organizations and Penn State. And I think finding those partnerships can be really, really helpful and a really good opportunity for you to explore whether or not a public policy path is what you want to do. And so I think getting experience in that world, in the policy world, is helpful. And you're so close to Harrisburg that if there are opportunities, especially like during the legislative session, if there are public policy organizations that you can intern with or reach out to get exposure to what a legislative session is like. There's so much about policymaking and the legislative process that I had no idea about before I came to WSIPP. And it was a really quick learning experience for me of kind of the behind the scenes, how everything works. And I think it's really valuable for graduate students to see that side of the process. In academia, you know, we just look and see if our article was cited and then we know someone read it. In public policy, it's different. You have people talking about your research constantly. And so I think getting immersed in that legislative environment and seeing that process and seeing the conversations that happen before policy decisions are made can kind of help you think about how to craft your research to fit in those conversations. But if you've never been in those conversations, you might not really know what they're looking for. And so I think exposing yourself to the policymaking process as often as you can is really important.
Great. And I want to follow up with a question from Kai Althaus, who's one of our members of our first graduating cohort, the MPP class of 2021. And he actually interned also with the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections for Sentencing. Is that right, Catherine? Right. Yeah. Okay. Right. And so he is asking, do you ever run into any ethical dilemmas as a dispassionate observer? For example, if an organization were to use your research to justify a policy that is nefarious or may negatively impact the lives of juvenile offenders, what can you do to combat any improper interpretation or utilization of your research? So that's a great question, especially following up what you were just talking about how your research really gets out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our research is available online, download by anyone. And there are times when I've seen people presenting at the legislature and all of a sudden one of their slides is a figure from one of our studies. And it's like, oh, hey, look, they're using our research. But then maybe they don't quite interpret it correctly. And so this does happen. And for us, you know, there's a recognition that that's always going to happen. That's kind of inevitable, especially in the world that we live in with so much information that people are trying to digest. But there's two things. One is being really intentional when you're writing your reports. And so we have a pretty thorough internal editing process where our reports are edited by subject matter experts and by, you know, quantitative scholars, but then also by members of our administration who are looking out for potential areas of controversy or potential linguistic choices, like really small linguistic choices that maybe we want to use this word instead of that word. And then there are certain things that we're very intentional about that kind of we want to either continue pushing the state in a particular direction because we know that's the way it's moving, or we want to introduce something. So in that question, there was the term juvenile offenders, and we actually don't use the term offender at all in our literature, in our research studies anymore. And that's a reflection of some bigger movements in the state, but also our choice of being very intentional with the language that we're using in our reports. when things do get misinterpreted, because they do, it's just reaching out to people. A lot of times it's I like to assume that people aren't having a nefarious intent when that happens, and that it's just a misunderstanding of the methods. And a lot of times I think about, like, how could I have actually written the report in a way that was more clear so they didn't interpret it that way? And that helps. I'll reflect on that when I'm writing future reports, but I'll also just reach out to them, shoot them an email and say, hey, noticed that you used this research. I just wanted to clarify that this is actually the correct interpretation. If you want to have a phone call to chat about it, if I can help answer your questions. And so it's a lot of outreach, and people are really receptive to that. I think there's never been a time where I've said, oh, hey, actually, like, it's a little different than kind of what you said. And I've never had anyone say, well, I don't care. I'm going to interpret it how I want. It's rarely, if ever, going to happen. A lot of times it's just an innocent mistake, or it's because people are reading research with their own biases and their own background. They're coming at it from a very particular perspective. And so maybe that causes them to read the information a little bit differently than other people. But we really try as hard as we can in our reports to communicate things very clearly and to help people interpret things as much as possible. When we do figures, data visualization, sometimes there's one report that we did a couple years ago, 2 years ago, I think, where we have some pretty complicated graphs that people may not be familiar. It's not just a simple bar chart or a simple line chart. And so we have like 6 graphs that are actually looking at the analysis. And before those, we have an example graph. And then we have little text boxes with little arrows that's like, when you're reading this, like, this is what this is, and this is what this is, and like, this is an example of an interpretation of this graph. Now here's the 6 actual graphs that you're interpreting. And so really just walking people through how to read research. It's something that it's another part of your job as a public policy researcher. It's not just to do the research, but to help people understand how to read research and how to understand research.
That's another part of that adapting the way you communicate technique as well. We have another question here from one of our first year students, Rebecca LaBelle. What specifically inspired you to pursue a nonpartisan career?
I really value the role of objective research. I think that a lot of times the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so I was driven by my like underlying value of the role that objective data and evidence can play in public policy. And I think that in some of the most contentious conversations I've seen among policymakers who just totally disagree, the one thing that can get them to the table and that can really foster some really great conversations that move both sides a bit more to the middle and forward towards finding a solution and a compromise is data and is quality research. And being nonpartisan, there's a certain responsibility to do it very well and to do it objectively. But then there's also the credibility that comes with that. You know, I don't work for either side. I work for both sides. I work for everyone. I work for the state of Washington and the whole of the legislature. And so that allows me to have some credibility in these conversations, that I'm listening to everyone because I want to hear everyone's sides. And then I'm going to dig into the data and just see what the data actually say, and then communicate it back to everyone in the same way. I really enjoy that aspect of it and that objectivity, and the way that the nonpartisan role can really help move policy forward in some areas where you think it's super contentious and both sides are just disagreeing. So I always valued, ever since I started graduate school, my cat's just knocked something off the table. When I started graduate school, one of the first things you talk about in our PhD program was that you have to be objective. You have to be objective, but no one's really objective. So recognize your biases and know that, and control them, or be honest about them. I I think sometimes that gets lost as you continue through your graduate school or through your career. And I think that, like I said, there is a place for that. There is a place for partisan work. There's a place for advocacy work, but I just felt compelled and pulled toward the really objective nonpartisan work and policy. I love working with policymakers. I love working with stakeholders. I really enjoy seeing the light bulbs go off when I am talking to them about a really complex statistical model that I know took me months to do. And like, they'll never understand the lines of code and Stata that went behind what these 4 graphs that I produced. But when you can talk with them and when you can see that they get it, and when they start using some of that language, and when they start to recognize things like selection bias, I just think that's so cool, and that's such a privilege that I'm able to have those conversations, and that I can impact policy in that way.
Lauren, as I'm listening to you again, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. In terms of staying nonpartisan, and you've also talked about being with an academic audience versus with a policymaking audience. I'm just really curious about perhaps how you prepare yourself to make the necessary pivots to really get the message home to your audience. So I know you've mentioned you prep with your teams, but what have you personally done to build some of your skills, and what might you advise our students to do to build their skills to think on their feet a little bit more? Because I'm suspecting there's probably an aspect of comfort level there as well.
Just talk to people. That is the number one advice I can give to people is, you're not going to get better at communicating just thinking about communicating. You just have to do it. And so even if I remember, I'm not sure if I can explain this in the right way. Like, I have this concept, I'm not sure they're going to get it. I'll call my mom. My mom doesn't have a super great research background. She doesn't have a PhD. She's not a statistician. And so can I explain it to her in a way that she gets? And she's totally external. She's not involved at all. Right. And so she's going to ask great questions. And I know I have colleagues who do the same. They're like, yeah, I just call my parents and explain it to them. Like, if I can explain it to them, I can, I'm good. And as far as the academic side, there's a level of communicating in academia even that I think that's a skill development in and of itself. And it's talking with your colleagues and talking with your peers and finding people that you feel safe communicating with and around, where when you do mess up, you're not going to be super embarrassed and super judged, because you have to. You have to try and communicate, and you're going to fail and you're going to mess it up. And so carving out that safe space to just practice talking about it. And so I think there's a writing aspect that we get a lot of emphasis on, particularly in our traditional school systems, that we need writing courses. We need to be good at writing. There's an oral communication aspect that is just as important. And so just talking about it, just having conversations with people, talking to people about your research, and in different levels. And then the other thing is recording yourself, which sounds like kind of weird sometimes, but I've given this advice even to my colleagues that I've seen them give presentations, and I notice that they do things in their presentations that I know that they don't know they do. And so I can tell them they do it, and that's one thing. But if you see yourself doing it, it makes it so much easier to recognize in yourself. And so, especially with the pandemic, we have lots of great resources. I've been encouraging people to record their practice presentations and listen back to them. And people are oftentimes really good at identifying, quirks or verbal fillers in other people when other people are presenting, but they don't notice it in themselves when they're presenting. But if they watch themselves, if they watch a recording, then they'll see it and they'll recognize it. And so that's a big one too, is practicing.
That's great advice.
And recording it. Mm-hmm.
Great advice. People often hate to do that, but it's fabulous advice. Talking about those presentations, can you talk a little bit about the types of presentations that you give most often in the type of work that you do?
I'd say most often there's two. There's a 15-minute, you've got to explain a big research project that you just spent a year working on to stakeholders or legislators. And then there's hour-long presentations where you really get into the weeds and you have a lot of questions. So most of our presentations are to agency stakeholders. If we're writing a report about child welfare or a report about Department of Corrections, even if it was a legislative assignment, and those agencies will oftentimes want to read out. In my work, I do a lot of presentations to the executive strategy teams of the agencies. And so this is the head of the Department of Corrections or the head of a sub-department in a state agency. And so a lot of executive leadership teams. And then the big one that we do is our legislative hearings. And so legislative hearings vary. Sometimes they're work sessions where a legislative committee is hosting a work session where the committee members are talking about one or two topics where they know that they're pursuing a policy change. And so they want some information gathering or an opportunity for public testimony. And so they'll contact us and say, hey, we know you did a report on this, or hey, we know that like you have background in this. Can you come give a presentation, 30 minutes discussing this topic? And we'll do that for the committee. Those are all typically recorded by TVW, which is our state TV organization here. And so they're all recorded and then archived online. And it's just in front of the committee members, and they all have a range. Obviously, it's usually both parties, and they come from various regions of the state and various legislative agendas themselves. And so it's a gamut of questions. And you never know what the legislators are going to ask. And to me, I think that's pretty fun because you actually get a little bit of insight into what they're thinking about and what their priorities are based on the types of questions that they ask. And so that can help you then in future communications with them. You get the opportunity to know them better. And so those legislative hearings, I think, are probably the most common and interesting and fun. And then we do presentations to legislative staff, because a lot of times legislative staffers are the ones who are actually will communicate with directly about wordsmithing language in a bill or something, and they'll communicate to the legislators. And so a lot of times we go through legislative staff, and so they're the ones reading our research most often, communicating with the legislators about it. Because I did forget to mention this earlier, but when you're writing your reports, one thing about public policy is that data visualizations, you mentioned that those are important, but we always expect that people read the executive summary and then they don't have a lot of time. And so how your research does get interpreted is very important. But like we have an executive summary on the front page of our report where if they don't read a single page of the 70-page report and they just read this executive summary, they will know everything they need to know about what we found. And that's really incredibly difficult. But that's the kind of information that legislators will get and that the legislative staff are working to communicate to the legislators. And so we present a lot of times to the legislative staff and get a lot of great questions from them because they're so immersed in the legislative process.
So that executive summary, as you've mentioned, is critically important, and being able to summarize what you're thinking in a concise yet precise way is a real challenge. And it's something I know that we emphasize greatly in our writing skills with our students. And I'm curious, as you think about these different presentations that you do, I'm sure there are times when the data are going to tell you a message that may be controversial or counter to what an agency or legislator might be expecting. To the extent that you can share when you've had that situation happen, or at least give us some insight into how you prepare yourself for that kind of presentation, I think that would be really helpful. Love to hear what you think.
I think I kind of alluded to this situation a while ago, and this is one that we talk about all the time because it was exactly what you're asking about. So we were asked to evaluate the aggression replacement training program, which is a program that was used by the juvenile courts for youth involved in the juvenile courts here in Washington. It was one of the most widely used programs. We have two that are used almost universally across the state. It was ART and FFT, functional family therapy. And there were some questions raised about the efficacy of ART and whether or not it was still working to reduce recidivism. So we were contracted to do an updated evaluation. And in our agency, we classify programs as evidence-based, research-based, promising, null, or poor. And so the legislature has passed statutes in the past that say juvenile courts in the state of Washington get a certain amount of funds for putting youth into rehabilitative programs. But those funds can only be used for programs that we, WSIPP, have designated as evidence-based or research-based. And so they have to meet a minimum threshold of effectiveness. And then we also look at whether or not they're cost beneficial. So this was a program that for 15 years, 20 years almost, we had said was evidence-based, and it's been evaluated nationally by different organizations and is said as research or evidence-based by various different inventories. And we looked at it, and it was not having positive outcomes for youth. In fact, there were some instances where youth participating ended up having worse outcomes, that they were more likely to recidivate. And this was a really big deal because it is one of the key critical programs that courts use to rehabilitate youth. And all of a sudden, we put out our new updated report that says it's no longer evidence-based or research-based, which means that it's no longer eligible for state funds. And that's a lot of money that goes towards that program, that all of a sudden the juvenile courts can't use that funding on that program, and they don't have a program to put youth in, because it's not like we said art doesn't work, but now we have this other program that we will say works. It doesn't the inventory. There was no trade-off. It was just, well, this program doesn't work, so now you've gone from 6 eligible programs to 5. And in fact, during that same time, we had totally revisited all of the programs, and we knocked a couple other programs off of our evidence-based and research-based classification too. So we almost halved the programs that were available for the juvenile courts. And that's hard, because as a researcher, I don't like knowing that the courts don't have programs to put these youth in, and that these youth need assistance and support systems. And now these programs aren't able to be used for these youth. So it puts you in a spot where you have to reconcile all of those feelings and emotions. But at the end of the day, I think we knew that it was going to be controversial. We knew that it was going to have a pretty big impact. And for me, the biggest thing was I need to make sure that I'm right. I need to be right. And so this is an instance where the report is 70 pages. The main report is 20 pages. And there are 50 pages of technical appendices. And those technical appendices are sensitivity analyses left and right. I specifying testing multiple different specifications, different comparison groups, different modeling approaches, different measurement operationalizations of the outcome measurement, and really making sure that there's convergence in those outcomes and those findings across a multitude of tests, so that I can be confident that when I say this program isn't working, it's not working, because I know it's going to have a huge impact. So that's the first thing, is doing your due diligence. And that is so important in the public policy world. And I know no one's going to read that 70-page report, the 50 pages of technical appendices, but I can at least say that we did it, and we tested it 12 different ways. The other thing is that we've tried to understand why. Like, we want to know why too. And so this program that 20 years ago we said works, we now say doesn't work. Why? And so we were able to do, this is one of the rare times where we were able to do a supplemental report, where we put out that report on looking at changes in the populations and the policies and the practices of juvenile courts that can help explain those controversial or unexpected or surprising findings. Because it's one thing to just kind of put the finding out in the world, but with something like that, it's important to try and provide some additional information to help understand why you're seeing those outcomes. And then also in that report, we do say, like, here are some things that we need to make sure we're looking at in the future, or here are some possible areas of research where, given what we know now, given how things have changed, what are some next paths you could pursue with research, or things that we could look at to help you make future policy decisions. And so, and as much as you can, being preemptive about that, and being really forward thinking, and then just being honest. Like, I know, they know that I know they're upset. And when stakeholders, we all understand, and we know, you have to know that we all want the same thing. We are all striving for the best public policies to help the citizens in the state of Washington. Like that is, everyone wants that. And so when you can recognize that, it's really easy to get everyone at the table, even when your findings are controversial. If you've done it right and you've done your due diligence, you can be confident going into those communications, and then you have to know where they're at. And it's like I said before, kind of understanding them and where they're coming from, and meeting them where they're at with your communication strategies. So.
Well, Lauren, we are just about out of time, but I wanted to ask you if you had any final words of advice.
Practice. Just talk. Just talk to people.
Just talk.
Yeah, you just have to try in different settings. I think one of the lines in this intro was from elevator speeches to public testimony. And I'll never forget my interview for my job. And one of the questions was, okay, imagine you're getting on an elevator with a legislator and you have the length of the elevator ride to explain the findings from a research report you just published. We'll give you like 40 seconds to prep, and then you've got to go, and we'll say the elevator ride's like 60 seconds. I had no idea what an elevator speech was. I learned. And so you have to practice everything from communicating in 60 seconds to being able to communicate for 60 minutes. And it's a skill that just takes time to develop, and you have to practice like anything else.
Well, thank you so much to our special guest, Lauren Knoth, and thank you for all of your great questions. We hope that you'll join us on Wednesday, March 17th at 11:30 when we talk about emotional intelligence, what it is, why it's important, and how it will make you a better leader. You can watch past events from this and our other series from the School of Public Policy on our YouTube channel, and you'll find a link to that and information about our program at publicpolicy.psu.edu. I'm Whitney Sheridan with Catherine Baumgartner. For all of us at the School of Public Policy, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Thanks so much, Lauren.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.